It's Thursday morning, August the 29th, 1912, and the coffin containing the body of General William Booth is carried out of the Salvation Army's international headquarters to begin its journey to Abney Park Cemetery. 3,000 police are on duty, marshalling the event and keeping back the crowds. Over 7,000 uniformed Salvationists, including 40 separate brass bands, march behind the hearse. And hundreds of thousands of onlookers pack the streets all the way from central London to the cemetery in Hackney, 5 miles away. The majority are working-class Londoners who recognised in William Booth someone who was on their side, someone who had a genuine passion for the poor. William Booth was born on the 10th of April 1829 here at number 12 Nottingtone Place in Sneinton, then on the edge of Nottingham. It was a middle-class home for a middle-class family, but the threat of poverty was never far away. Samuel Booth, William's father, fancied himself as an entrepreneur. He'd been born poor and was determined he wasn't going to stay that way, so he embarked on a series of different business ventures. Now, some of them worked out well and the family prospered, but others went disastrously wrong, which is what happened in 1842 when a building project he'd invested in went bust. Drastic economies had to be made, and at the age of 13, William was taken out of school and sent to work to earn some money for the family. He was apprenticed to Francis Eames, a pawnbroker in Goosegate, Nottingham.
William saw those same people every week, week in, week out. Monday morning to pawn the Sunday best, wedding ring. Hopefully on Friday back to redeem it with the wages that they'd earned. But then back the next week, exactly the same. But even in their family life, he was aware of poverty. His family could very easily themselves have fallen into poverty when his father died. But they didn't. He was able to go out to work, and that was part of what saved them in that respect. But very easily he could have been one of those having to use the pawnbrokers.
Up until now, William had attended the local parish church, St Stephen's, Sneinton, along with his sisters. But he didn't like it. The high church formality left him cold. "My heart was a blank," he said. But after the death of his father, he felt free to switch his allegiance to a Wesleyan Methodist church, Broad Street Chapel in Nottingham. The preaching at Broad Street and the small class meeting or fellowship group he was part of spoke to him strongly, and at the age of 15, he dedicated his life to Jesus Christ. He was converted.
I think William Booth's conversion changed everything. I think that experience, that encounter he had with God at that early age, transformed his thinking from that point on.
For him, it meant that he only wanted to do what God wanted him to do. And he felt that if everybody could just do that, live in the will of God, then lives would be transformed and communities and the world even be transformed.
In that moment, he realised that that message that he discovered in his own heart was for everybody. It was for every man, every woman, every boy and every girl. And he was passionately, in that moment, convinced that everyone needed to hear this message.
But in reality, the new working class of the industrial cities never had a chance to hear the gospel. The mainstream churches were either unwilling or unable to connect with them. So William was more than happy to join a group of young people who began preaching in a deprived part of Nottingham. It convinced him that this was his mission in life, to be an evangelist, and he became a lay preacher. But he also had to earn a living, and when his apprenticeship as a pawnbroker came to an end, he had to find another job. He hoped the local Methodists would take him on, but no door opened, he said. I had to move to London. He was 20 years old.
He ended up living and working here at the shop of William Filmer in Kennington. Much to his regret, it was another pawnbroker's, but it was all he was qualified for. So for the next 3 years, he worked at the shop 6 days a week and preached almost every evening and every Sunday in Methodist chapels and on street corners, until a sponsor, one Edward Harris Rabbits, came to his rescue. His promise of £1 a week meant that William could finally become a full-time preacher. So on the 9th of April 1852, he left the pawnbrokers for good. And to cap everything, the next day, his 23rd birthday, he realised he was in love.
Catherine Mumford was just 3 months older than him, and they'd met the previous year when she'd heard him preach.
And happily for William, she obviously liked him too. And in May 1852, they became engaged. They married here at Stockwell New Chapel 3 years later. To start with, William was a travelling evangelist, and they were almost constantly on the road. But then he was put in charge of a Methodist circuit, first in Brighouse in Yorkshire, and then on Tyneside in Gateshead. And it was in Gateshead that Catherine's eyes were really opened to the conditions of the poor.
Well, Catherine was extremely well read. Although she'd led a fairly sheltered life, she knew her scripture inside out, and she'd read widely philosophers and other theologians, and so she had a real understanding that God cared about the poor, that he had a heart for those who were on the margins of society. And this would have made up their private conversations. This would have been a subject that they would have talked about, but also it would have been the subject of Catherine's preaching as well. She was already an excellent preacher.
When she spoke, people really listened, and she really did make a huge difference at a time when women preachers weren't really accepted. And I think what was great was that William Booth allowed her, enabled her to do that. I think she would have done it anyway, whether he would have said that or not. But what is wonderful as I read the history is that Catherine was right at the forefront of ministry there, starting at Gateshead, but then all over the world.
Both William and Catherine were in great demand as speakers and evangelists. But William still had his local responsibilities in Gateshead, responsibilities from which the Methodist authorities refused to free him, which William found incredibly frustrating. By 1861, it had all become too much. He resigned and became an independent evangelist, leading campaigns all over the country.
But in 1865, the Booths returned to London with their 6 children so that Catherine could fulfil a series of preaching engagements. They rented a house in Hammersmith, 5 miles that way, but William was drawn 3 miles this way, to the heart of the East End and the worst slums in London. He began to preach on the street by the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel, and he was heard by some members of the East London Special Services Committee. They were so impressed, they invited him to lead 6 weeks of meetings in a tent they'd set up just around the corner. The tent was here, in what used to be the old Quaker burial ground. And the meetings were a success. The audience might have been rough, apparently the place stank of gin and beer, but the people listened and responded. And to his surprise, William, who up until now had assumed he'd have a country-wide preaching ministry, began to think maybe God was calling him to this small area. He said, "I found my heart being strongly and strangely drawn out on behalf of 1 million people living within a mile of the tent. Why go further afield for audiences?" Or as he put it to his wife, "Darling, I found my destiny." William Booth's East London Christian mission grew steadily. They held their meetings in any premises they could get hold of, from music halls to skittle alleys and all stops in between. In fact, it seemed the more unchurch-like the venue, the better.
William really had a heart for people who felt uncomfortable in the regular church of the day, and he found ways, devised ways of communicating with people who wouldn't normally go to church, partly through the venues, but also hitting on this idea of people from the East End sharing their own stories, sharing their testimony of what God had done in their lives with their neighbours, with their friends, publicly and privately.
He used every technique, he used every kind of person he could think of who got saved so that they could relate to that crowd in a relevant, meaningful, exciting, and often a very visual way.
Meanwhile, Catherine Booth was discovering how desperate life was for the poorest of the poor. She met women who'd been forced into prostitution. She assured them that she was no better than them. She was a sinner too. But she'd found salvation through Jesus, and so could they.
But she also spoke out about the social injustice these women faced. Why should polite society condemn them and yet turn a blind eye on the behaviour of their male customers? It wasn't right.
William too was realising that the social conditions of the poor couldn't be ignored. This is the 1867 annual report of the Christian Mission. It's tiny, but it shows that as well as preaching, there were evening classes, ragged schools as they were called, free education for local children, reading rooms, soup kitchens, and the relief of the poor. And playing an increasing part in the mission were the Booth children. Bramwell Booth, William and Catherine's eldest son, was running a chain of 5 Food for the Millions shops when he was just 16. These shops provided cheap food, but more than that, customers were treated as individuals. Their names and addresses were taken, and they were followed up and visited at home. By 1877, the Christian Mission had 36 full-time evangelists and about 3,000 members, and numbers were growing month by month, which meant more and more work and longer hours for everyone. So when in 1878, William Booth and his secretary were working on a leaflet that described the Christian Mission as a volunteer army, Bramwell Booth objected. Volunteers in the British Army were part-time reservists, and he was no part-timer. "I'm a regular soldier or nothing," he said. William promptly crossed out the word volunteer and replaced it with salvation. So it now read, "The Christian Mission is a Salvation Army." The name stuck.
When William Booth hit on the idea of changing the name Christian Mission to the Salvation Army, he hit on a gem of an idea. It was something that captured people's imagination at the time. And the idea that everybody who joined the Salvation Army was an active soldier, not just an audience member, somebody in the congregation, but actually every soldier fighting for right, fighting against evil, was the key to the Salvation Army's success at that time.
Over the next few years, the Salvation Army took off. It was no longer just an East End mission. It was a nationwide phenomenon, hard at work in the poorest parts of Britain's industrial towns and cities. "We are moral scavengers," said William Booth in 1880, "preaching in the very sewers. We want the lowest of the low."
But alongside the success came opposition. Middle-class Britain thought the Salvation Army was vulgar, or this preaching on street corners, putting Christian words to music hall songs, banging on tambourines and drums. Not to mention letting uneducated men stand up and preach, and women too. In some places, opposition was actually violent. Here in Sheffield, there was a massive Salvation Army rally in January 1882, with a march through the city centre to a hall very close to here. William and Catherine Booth were riding in the middle of the procession in an open carriage. But at the front of the column, wearing a scarlet tunic and riding a white horse, was champion wrestler Lieutenant Emerson Davison. It must have been quite a sight, but it provoked part of the crowd.
First, there was just shouting. Then somebody threw something. And before they knew it, the police had a riot on their hands. Emerson Davison, at the front, was hit on the head and seriously injured, and had to be held up on his horse by his comrades, while the police and other Salvationists made sure the booths were safe.
This was just one of dozens of incidents in a year that saw 669 Salvationists injured, 251 of them women, and 56 army buildings damaged.
The Salvation Army was really stirring things up. There was inevitable opposition, pubs were being closed, there were marches in the streets, Salvation Army gathering crowds to listen to them.
Some people got really upset because they spoke against alcohol. And you can imagine those in charge of the taverns and the inns and those who sold alcohol getting really upset about that. This would mean they would lose business. And then, of course, local magistrates didn't want the Salvation Army marching on the streets. It caused opposition, it caused a row, it caused fighting in the streets, and they didn't want that upset there.
And whenever the status quo is churned up, there are always people who don't like it. But the opposition only actually served to kind of fuel the enthusiasm for growth. And the Salvation Army continued to grow during that period.
The Salvation Army's growth wasn't confined to the United Kingdom. By 1883, it was at work on all 5 continents, mostly as a result of British Salvationists emigrating, taking their Salvation Army beliefs and practices with them, and asking for support from the army back home. The former East London Christian Mission now had to have an international headquarters.
And from those headquarters here on this same site in London, the Salvation Army was now actively campaigning on behalf of the poor. One February morning in 1885, the officer on duty unlocked the front door and found a girl sleeping on the doorstep. She'd escaped from a brothel where she'd been tricked into working. Her story brought the reality of child prostitution to the front of everyone's minds at headquarters. The booths took up the cause, alongside the journalist W.T. Stead. To show how easy it was to buy and sell a young girl, Bramwell Booth and Stead bought 13-year-old Eliza Armstrong from her mother for £5 before handing her over to the care of the Salvation Army in France. Stead then ran the story in a great exposé in his Pall Mall Gazette. It was a publishing sensation, and it resulted in a change in the law, with the age of consent being raised to 16. It also resulted in Stead and 2 women who'd worked with him being jailed. Fighting for the poor took courage. The next target was homelessness. Very late one night in 1888, William Booth was returning from a speaking engagement. And as his cab was crossing London Bridge, he looked out of the window and noticed men sleeping rough in the alcoves of the old bridge. Early the next morning, he summoned his son Bramwell and told him to do something about it. Bramwell tried to explain, well, it's not that easy, but his father wouldn't listen. I don't care about all that stuff, he said. Go and do something.
His attitude was always go and do something. Where he saw a need, where he saw an injustice, where he saw something that needed to change, he wanted to see action. And the Salvation Army, he believed, were the people to get their sleeves rolled up and make a difference.
Bramwell did as his father told him, and he rented a large building in London's Docklands. It was a place where homeless men could come and find shelter for the night and cheap food. The Limehouse Depot, as it was called, really came into its own in 1889 during a bitter dock strike.
It was the centre of a huge Salvation Army relief effort for the dockers and their families. The London newspapers were impressed. The The Salvation Army was having an impact on society. Things were going well. And then at the age of 61, Catherine Booth died. She'd been suffering from cancer for 3 increasingly painful years. She'd been determined to support William and help lead the army for as long as she could, and she survived much longer than the doctors thought possible. But finally, in October 1890, her strength ran out. It was a devastating blow, especially for William.
I think William and Catherine were a great team. Their marriage was one where their giftings complemented each other.
Catherine was hugely influential on William as his wife, as his inspiration, the love of his life, but also as his guide, as his counsellor, but also hugely influential on the Salvation Army as well, as she brought all her understanding of scripture, of theology, and also her passion, her heart for God and for the lost.
I think together they really were able to help each other, and we see the effects. In a very quick time, this idea, this movement spread, not just in this country, but all over the world. I don't think that would have happened with just William. I don't think it would have happened with just Catherine.
Just 2 weeks after Catherine's death, the book that William had been working on all the previous year was published. It was called In Darkest England and the Way Out, and Catherine had been a major influence. The title came via the explorer Henry Morton Stanley. He had been thrilling Victorian England with his talk of darkest Africa, where people could get lost in impenetrable jungles. William Booth argued that there was also a darkest England, in which millions of people were just as lost, trapped in poverty and deprivation from which there seemed no escape. In the front of every copy of the book was this fold-out poster. At the bottom of the picture are some of the 3 million people in Britain who were drowning in a sea of starvation, unemployment, homelessness, and crime. They're being rescued by the Salvation Army, whose social campaign, with its slogan, "Work for All," will transform their lives. First stop for the rescued is the city colony.
William Booth was a caring man. He loved people, but he also wanted people to have that feeling of self-worth and dignity. And one of the ways that he encouraged that was for people to work, for example. He didn't just want to give them handouts. He wanted to give them a trade. He wanted to help them to develop that, and then to give them a job whereby they could get money themselves and then make a better living for themselves and their family.
So at the heart of William's growing understanding of the good news of the gospel was that when lives were transformed, every aspect of the person's life was transformed. Their heart, but also their practical circumstances.
This is Hadley in Essex, and land that was bought by William Booth for the farm colony, which was the next stage on in his radical scheme. There was a brick factory here, making Salvation Army bricks, like this, WB William Booth.
Men could learn the skills needed for that, but they could also learn how to be farmers and market gardeners, skills that would give them a new chance in life in this country or abroad.
As for actually implementing the scheme, much of that, and indeed much of the day-to-day administration of the Salvation Army, was now left to his son Bramwell. That meant William was now free to concentrate on being an evangelist worldwide and promoting the army wherever he went.
From the start, William Booth recognised the importance of publicity and capturing people's imaginations. At first, that just meant photographs. But when in the 1900s film became available for the first time, the general wanted to make use of it and show his army to the world. Here he is at the 3rd International Congress at the Crystal Palace in London. and saluting the delegations as they march past. In the United States, he was filmed with his daughter Evangeline on the street and also on a rooftop studio set. You can see the paper on his desk rustling in the breeze. Another new invention he made use of was the motor car. He was no longer at the mercy of railway routes and timetables. He could go from town to town and stop at villages on the way and preach. What's more, it would be newsworthy. A motor car with General Booth inside and someone filming it. No wonder it drew the crowds.
There's no doubt that William's message appealed to the masses, to the ordinary man in the street, but it also pricked the conscience of Victorian England and presented a new way of seeing things, a way of social justice and transformation.
Over the next few years, William Booth continued to travel abroad. The Salvation Army was now operating in 58 countries, and he was able to visit many of them. William Booth may have found his destiny in the East End, but his mission now encompassed the world. But he was an old man and was becoming increasingly frail. By the summer of 1912, he was blind and very tired, and on Tuesday, August the 20th, he died. He was 83.
The following morning, a notice was put up in the window of the Salvation Army's international headquarters. It read, "The General has laid down his sword."
As the funeral procession neared the gates of Abney Park Cemetery, the International Staff Band struck up "There's No Place Like Home."
William Booth was back home in the East End of London, where he had found his destiny among the poorest of the poor.
One of the remarkable things about William was that he saw something that needed doing and he got on and did it. He made things happen. And I think that should be our inspiration now. We see an injustice, see something that's wrong in society, and rather than bemoan the fact that we can't do anything, actually get on and make a difference.